Nonfiction books, are there myths about them? Well, absolutely, and there are some common ones. The first one is, do nonfiction books make you smarter? And there tends to be this idea that nonfiction books do make you smarter. And you kind of see the same thing with chess, actually. People tend to think that if you play chess, that you're going to be smarter, or that you're just a smarter person on average. It's a stereotype or it's a trope. I would argue that nonfiction books don't make you smarter. And in fact, I would probably argue that after reading 10 nonfiction books, your returns are significantly diminished. Um, I would probably say it's more fair to say that reading nonfiction books makes you more nuanced as a person. You have more nuanced takes about things, but I wouldn't say it makes you smarter. In fact, arguably, reading nonfiction books leaves you with more questions than it does with answers, makes you a more honest person about your lack of knowledge rather than more certain about your knowledge, which is usually you try to go into a nonfiction book to become more certain about something, but the consequence is that you come out with more questions. So nonfiction books don't, I would argue, make you smarter. Now, the second thing, or the second myth that I often hear about nonfiction books is that they are about reality. A lot of the times people will go to like fiction readers and be like, why don't you read something about reality rather than like being lost in your dreams or thoughts, whatever. But nonfiction isn't always about reality. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the times it isn't. And we can start with the most obvious case, philosophy. A lot of philosophy almost has nothing to do with reality. It's literally just like the workings of someone's inner imagination on how to like cut up the nature of reality. It's almost, you could say, pure thought. It has nothing to do with reality itself. This is one of the biggest complaints, if you could say, empiricists, is that there's a lot of intellectuals who are writing away in their nonfiction, and almost all of their works have nothing to do with the actual mechanics of reality. Now, you could even go a step further and look at something like history, and you say, well, history is about reality. Well, if you get to know the methodologies of history a little bit better, which I'm currently trying to do, you soon realize a lot of it's not reality. A lot of it is just generating narratives from different data points, but those narratives almost sometimes have nothing to do with how reality actually played out. You can kind of take different data points and infer theories about events that never actually happened, right? You can kind of add narratives to events that never happened. So that's another thing, that's another objection, is that it's not always about reality. Sometimes it's just a creative piece of work that tries to get to the underlying reality, but never really gets there. So that's like another myth about nonfiction books, is that they aren't always about reality, despite what people tell you. And this third myth that you kind of see, especially amongst the people who think that reading makes you smarter, or reading nonfiction in particular makes you smarter, is this idea that citing a nonfiction book somehow ends a debate or ends a discussion, and that like a single nonfiction book is the authoritative stance to have on any issue. It kind of is annoying, actually, that people do this. If it comes to, I don't know, let's say The Strange Death of Europe, people will cite this book as if it's like the end of discussion about the future of Europe, that multiculturalism is the destruction of Europe. They cite this one book. There's a lot of books like this where people will just cite it, and somehow that ends the debate or discussion. And a lot of the times, when you actually dig through the books that they cite, you'll find that when they cite other sources inside that book, that the sources they cite are questionable. I've seen a few people who have done this thing where they dig through the sources cited by popular nonfiction books, like Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and we'll find that the sources that Pinker himself cited can sometimes be questionable or debatable. It's never this authoritative thing that if you cite one nonfiction book, that's the end of the discussion. And which means when you read a nonfiction book about a particular topic, you shouldn't be walking away from it. Going back to the nonfiction books make you smarter, you shouldn't be walking away from that source and going, I can now trump everybody when it comes to this topic, right? Like you have somehow developed a hammer that's going to hit every nail you see. That is not what a nonfiction book is going to do. Again, if you're honest about reading a nonfiction book, you should be walking away with more questions than you have answers. Which brings me to my fourth point / myth, is that nonfiction books are objective or devoid of opinion, right? It's very popular in Western philosophy, or In the Western mindset, I can't speak too much about Eastern mindsets, but growing up in the West, I often heard people say that you should be talking about objective facts, right? You should be objective. You shouldn't have an opinion. You should use a data or be objective. But a lot of the time, this data requires interpretation. And that's a lot of the time what nonfiction books are trying to do, right? They're providing opinions to interpret data. They oftentimes are not just objective presentations of facts. And when you do find books that are objective presentations of facts and devoid of opinion, they're probably borderline unreadable unless you're an analyst. I have some economic handbooks that go over just pure measurements of different countries. They provide no opinions, and it's just a bunch of random numbers, page over page over page. Maybe sometimes they have a graph, but you probably wouldn't want to read that, right? Unless you're an analyst trying to make inferences about and using the data for models, right? But most of the time, I would say 9 times out of 10, nonfiction books are just loaded with opinion. Not fact, they're just loaded with opinion. They're not objective or anything like this. It's just someone's personal opinion. So those are some of the myths I find that are most prevalent with people who read nonfiction books. And a lot of the times they use these myths to like berate other readers, like fiction readers, or berate other people who just prefer not to read in general, right? You often hear, you should learn something about the world by reading. You can learn something about the world by not reading as well. And a lot of the times when you do read something, it's not necessarily about the world. It's just someone's opinion about some facts that occurred about the world. Nonfiction reading is not the end-all be-all for learning or intelligence. There's a lot of myths associated with nonfiction reading that you should be aware about before you get into it. But with that being said, let me know what you think, and bye-bye for now.